Hi guys. All right. Okay. Let's get started. Welcome to this the third Bay Area Ansible user group event. Thank you for coming. I want to start with thanking our sponsors tonight, BlueJeans and Ansible for BlueJeans providing the location and food, and Ansible has been supporting this meetup from the beginning, so they've been offering the drinks this time. Quick quick note, BlueJeans is hiring in his operations team, so if you're interested in working at BlueJeans, please go see Ricky. He's over there. Maybe he can raise his hand. All right. Okay. I guess I need to talk on the mic. Other than that, I want to just give a quick introduction of the presenter. Kirk Byers is going to be doing a 45 minutes presentation. I don't know if you know Kirk. I think some of you know him. I started tracking him on his website a few years ago. He has a lot of good content in there, so I invite you to check it after. He will introduce himself, of course, after. And then we'll have Jawhny Cooke that is over there. Also, it'll be a shorter presentation on how we use Ansible at BlueJeans. Other than that, please stay in this area or over there. Don't get in past that red tape. It's pretty obvious. And yeah, I don't think. I think that's about it. Bathrooms are over there on the right. That it? Ricky, did I forget anything? No? Did I forget anything? We're good? All right. All right. Thank you, guys.
This on? Okay. Does everybody hear me all right? All right. So definitely big thanks to BlueJeans, because I also run a meetup up in San Francisco, and I know that this is a lot of work. It's a lot of work to coordinate this stuff. It's a lot of work to make this all work. So big thanks to them. All right. So all right. Okay, so a few questions. So who here is sysadmin? Like if you would consider yourself sort of a sysadmin person. Okay, how about who would consider themselves more of a network engineer kind of person? Okay, how about, do you have people that sort of consider themselves more like a DevOps engineer or hybrid or whatever we want to call that nowadays? Okay, and how about other people? None of the above? I'll see if people didn't raise their hand. There's got to be a few others, right? Okay, we have a few others. Yeah, I know you're an other. A little bit. Okay, who has used or who uses Ansible quite extensively? Like you use it quite a bit day to day. Who has some familiarity with Ansible, but not a lot? And who just hasn't really used it, but has heard about it, but hasn't really used it before? Okay, cool. So a little bit of background on myself. So my background is as a network engineer. I'm a CCIE from a long time ago. I work on a few open source projects. So I worked on NetMiko, or I am working on NetMiko, which is an open source SSH library based on Paramiko. Basically tries to make it easier to interact with legacy devices. I did most of the work on the NAPALM iOS driver. So we'll talk about NAPALM a little bit today. I teach classes on Python for network engineers. I have a free course on Python for network engineers. You can find me here at this pynet.twb. You can also search for Python for network engineers, and you should see me. That's my son, so that's pretty much what I live for. And let's get started. So I guess in 2013, I saw on Twitter something from Jeremy Schulman, who was working at Juniper at the time, and he mentioned, well, there's this cool tool called Ansible, and I was trying to build a SaaS application to do network management at the time, and Jeremy said a lot of interesting things, so I sort of bookmarked that. I had went and started to research Puppet a little bit in the network automation space, sort of got weighted down with the Puppet abstractions and said, well, I'll come back to this in a little bit. I did some server automation with Fabric, some real small amount. And I said, well, why don't I look at this Ansible a little more? And one of the good things about Ansible is they made the documentation really easy to get started. So I was pretty much reading Ansible and 30 minutes, an hour into it, I was like, okay, I'm going to start using this at least for server work. This is cool. I'm going to start really using this for at least server tasks. And not too long after that, I sort of had this bad idea that, oh, well, I could build some sort of configuration templating system out of Python. And I started to think about that a little bit, and I started to work on it a very small amount. And then I realized not too long after that, well, hey, Ansible has this all built in. Why am I building this configuration templating system in Python? It's all right in Ansible. And that was sort of how I started getting involved in Ansible a little bit, was via looking at this configuration templating. I also did a talk on sort of what Arista had and what you could do. And this was in 2013. And it was pretty raw at the time with Arista. I mean, they had some Ansible modules. They let you configure VLANs, but it was pretty rough, meaning like I was going and fixing bugs they had in their code and doing things to make it work. And, the start of my talk was basically a long road projected in the distance saying we had a long ways to go. And now that's, 2.5 years later. And I think we are a lot farther. There's still quite a ways to go, but we are definitely a lot farther along. Now, one of the questions we have here is when we're talking about networking devices, there's a category of things like Cumulus, which are just Linux. And if you're a sysadmin, Ansible is going to operate just like it would some other Linux box. Now, there's a whole set of other devices, even though they're built on Linux, that there's a separation between sort of the network operating system and Linux. And you still have to figure out a way of how do I get my changes into the network operating system. So for these platforms, and there's sort of varying degrees of how much access you have on the Linux and what you can do with your Linux access. So Arista's pretty high up there as far as your Linux access, and then it gets, some of them are worse, and you have less Linux access, and it's harder to stuff things in. So for these platforms, and these are mainly the ones I'm going to be talking about today, so Arista, Cisco, Juniper, you're generally going to run all your Ansible on the Ansible control machine. The module is going to run locally. It's going to do something to reach out from that box to connect to the network device. So for older devices, it's just going to use an SSH channel. You're going to make changes via this SSH channel. For newer devices, you're going to use an API. Hopefully, it gives you back structured data. So we're pretty much going to be running everything on the control machine. Okay, so a few other points. So, we like to, especially in the Bay Area, really love to obsess about the data center, but there's a whole lot of networking, which is not the data center. So the WAN, people could have a whole bunch of remote sites, the enterprise network, wireless, voice. So there's a lot of networking besides the data center, and a lot of these places really should be automated as well. Network equipment lasts probably longer than server equipment. So there are things that were put in a long time ago that aren't going to go away for a while. So our life cycles are probably longer. And this also relates to that the hardware is more tied to the software in general. So a lot of times to replace your system, you have to get rid of the old one and bring in the new one. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to reuse the hardware and put a new OS on it. Some of that is changing with things like Cumulus, but for the most part, for other devices, those things are still tightly coupled. I would say network engineers are probably judged more on uptime, downtime than server engineers. Not that it's not important for server engineers, but the consequences are greater for when the network engineer screws up, and they have a little bit higher threshold. So I think that has made networking a little bit more risk averse. It's been a little bit harder for us to maybe do some of these things. Some of this is ideas that we accept. Some of this is sort of organizational problems of, you have to submit a change request to do anything, even though the server engineer is going and rebuilding the database, without a change request, I have to submit a change request to switch a VLAN, right? So, but sometimes it's our own doing as well. And then my last point is, if you care about automation, then end users need to make this matter. Like when they're buying equipment, you guys need to choose stuff that is better for automation. if you cannot automate your equipment and you're buying new stuff, then that's, really your fault. You should make sure that whatever you buy can be automated, that has good APIs, that there's good tooling, and that might be open source tooling, but there's good tooling associated with it. All righty. So what are some things that we can do with Ansible in a network automation context? So I mentioned a little bit of config templating. Configuration management is obviously really what Ansible is about. We can do some information gathering, and we can do operational actions. And I'll explain what I mean by operational actions here in a little bit. So here are some various things that we can do. Now, in this talk, I really want to sort of go through and sort of show you capabilities around 3 libraries or set of Ansible modules. So there's a set of Ansible modules in Ansible 2.1. There's a Python library and some associated Ansible modules in something called NAPALM. And then there's also some Ansible modules in this thing called ntc-ansible. So I really want to show you what are various things that we can do with these libraries. All right, config templating. So basically, you can use Ansible and its Jinja 2 capabilities to generate router configs, to generate parts of router configs. This is not all that new. There's quite a bit of information available on this, so I'm not really going to go into this in a lot of details. There's articles available out on the internet where you can probably read about this and come up to speed on this fairly quickly. Now, what about config management? Now, some high-level points on config management. So here I'm talking about, I want to have my control machine push configs, either parts of configs or entire configs, to network devices. Now, one way you could try to do this is through specific features. So for example, you could build a module, and Arista did this, where you say, I'm going to configure VLANs. And I have an Ansible module. It goes out and lets me set the VLAN ID, the VLAN name, and configure it. Or they have another module that lets me configure characteristics of switch ports. So can configure that. They have some module related to VXLAN. So you can configure these real specific features. And that sort of might work in the switching world where your set of features is fairly constrained. But if you get to routing, there's a lot of features in routing. If you look at, Cisco iOS, other large platforms, and you see everything you can configure, it's a lot of stuff. And even like features you'd say are really important. There's a lot of things out there. And you could be building a lot of these Ansible modules for a long, long time. So as opposed to that, you could say, well, what if we have a more generalized way of doing a configuration? And there's a couple of options for how we do a generalized way of doing a configuration. We could have a line-by-line changes. So what I mean by this is much more like going into, now we're doing this remote, but it's much more like going into config mode and putting in command 1, command 2, command 3, command 4, and exiting. So you're sort of manipulating the config line by line. Or we could have a mechanism that sort of does things more at a file level. So you either have an entire config file that you load, or you have like a section of a config file that you load. So both of these are fairly generalized because they are generalized because they don't care about the feature, but there's slightly different ways of implementing it. So the first one of these we're going to look at is in the Ansible 2.1 modules. And in Ansible 2.1, there's really three main modules. They have a platform underscore command, a platform underscore config, and a platform underscore template. And then platform could be iOS for Cisco iOS. It could be NXOS, EOS, Junos. I think they have iOS XR as well. So they have these modules, and these are built into Ansible 2.1. Okay, so let's look at an example. So any questions up to this point as far as like what I'm talking about, why we care about this at all? All right, so let's look at an example here. All right, I think we have a few people. All right. Okay, so here I'm logged into an AWS machine. And I have set up on this machine, I have this site.yaml file. Can people see this okay? So I've structured this in roles. So let's look at this Cisco iOS role. And basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to load a new host name onto two Cisco routers. So just little small ISR routers. Load a new host name. Now this is set up in Ansible's role structure. So I have this main.yaml file. I'm going to call this iOS template. So that's the module I'm calling. It's going to build my configuration change using this Jinja2 file. And all that Jinja2 file has in it is going to be a host name that it's going to set. If there's a change, I'm going to notify this handler called write-mem. And it's going to cause the write-mem command to execute. So pretty simple. And let me log into this router. All right, so there's the current host name. You can see the host name in the startup config right here. And let's go ahead and execute this playbook. Okay. You know, I've set up a few things with the host file behind the scenes. Host file is pretty straightforward. I want to show you the Cisco routers because those are the ones I'm working on. So here's the Cisco routers. There's an IP address, a username and password, but I've just stored those under host vars. So they're sort of hidden away. I think that's used, this variable is used later when we get to NAPALM. Okay. So we'll go ahead and execute this. I'm only going to run it on the Cisco devices here. Okay, so we're loading this template. It says it changed. We can see the handlers running, and it says it wrote mem there. So now if we go back, we see, okay, the host name changed on it. And since it did a start mem, or a write mem, excuse me, it also changed it in the startup config. So it's a simple change.
But it did it.
Yeah. Host name, test name. It used to be Pynet router. Got me nervous.
It was supposed to be Pynet something.
Whew. Tough. Okay. So, I mean, it's a simple change, but really the key point isn't the complexity of the change, but the mechanics of how we're pushing something out.
This also work on a regular iOS device like the 7200?
This is a regular iOS device.
Not XR or XR.
Yeah, this is a router about this big.
Which one?
The Cisco 881. So this is a real physical device. It's not a virtual, but it's just using an SSH channel to connect in.
Yeah, but the Cisco still has to run the Python script.
This is not, there's nothing running. There's no Python running on this router. Python is running on the control machine. The module is shipped out locally to the control machine. So it's in Ansible speak, it's using Ansible connection local. That control machine is issuing an SSH connection to the router and executing the commands. So it doesn't care if it's a 7200, it's an SSH channel. I have a similar, in that same site.yaml, I could also run it on Arista. Those are Arista VOS devices. Those are using eAPI, so if it supported eAPI, it would execute those changes as well. So this sort of comes back to my earlier statement of, is it Linux or is it not Linux? We're not running Python on Box. Some platforms like Nexus, they do have it on Box, but it ends up being more of a pain than it's worth. It's much better to run it on the control machine and either interface to the API if it has an API, or if it doesn't have an API or its API is no good, then interface through the SSH channel. Okay, and then let's just run a second little playbook that will, this is just a different role, and this just restores the config back to its original host name. So if this works correctly, then this will get set back to PyNet router 1. So we just set it back basically. And like I said, and I had tested these earlier, I have in this same playbook, run it on Arista, run it on Juniper. I think that uses the API, and that uses netconf. So, the first one was using an SSH channel. This one's using the netconf API. Arista, I'd have to check. I think it's probably using the API, but I would have to check on how the Ansible module coded that. Okay, so any questions about that? Okay. So that's pretty simple, not too much to that. Now, I think there are a few interesting features in the Ansible 2.1 config. So they have the platform_config, and they did add some interesting features here that help you with the config hierarchy. So you can specify a parent. So for example, and I'll show you an example here in a second, you can specify before, match, and replace. And let's look at an example because it makes a lot more sense there. Can you guys see that in the back, or is that too small? Beside being on the green font. All right, well, I think that's as big as I can make it. I'll read it out to you. So the key thing I wanted to show here is this is the iOS config module. This provider is just a way of, it's a dictionary. So it provides the host, the IP ad, or the host, the username, and the password. Here are the config lines I'm going to add, just 5 access list lines. The parent is the IP access list. So the access list name, this one's just called test1. So this is the parent to these 5 lines. This before action will be executed whenever a change is required. So in this case, it's actually going to drop the ACL. So it doesn't know on the access list. So basically it's going to remove this ACL if it needs to change it. So like if we had an ACL that only had 3 of these lines, it would detect that, oh, all the lines aren't present. I'm going to drop the current ACL. I'm going to apply the new ACL with these 5 lines. Now, obviously in real world scenario, you need to make sure of things like dropping the ACL is okay and doesn't break things. So you might want to do things like, oh, we have a sequence number like test 1-99, and you put the new ACL in and then flop it or something like that. But for testing purposes, this is fine. It was easy. Then there's some other criteria. It's replace and match. And these control aspects of, the match controls aspects of what has to be there in order for it to change it. And match exact means the order matters, and it has to be exactly this set of commands. So it has to have all 5 and nothing more. And there's other options to match. There's something called strict, and there's something called line. So these underscore config modules do have some interesting characteristics that aren't really present in these other modules that I'm going to talk about. So this is something that's useful in these Ansible 2.1 modules. So any questions on Ansible 2.1 and things that are present there? Okay, so let's move on and talk about NAPALM. So NAPALM's library, the 2 main people working on it are David Barrasso and I'm going to mispronounce his name. It's something like Mirsal Olenek. I'm going to butcher his name, but that was my closest I could get. You can look up on GitHub and see who's done a lot of commits. Now, NAPALM is a Python framework. It supports a whole bunch of different vendors. So Nexus, Cisco iOS, Arista, Juniper. I think they have some Fortinet support. I think they have some PanOS, so some Palo Alto support. They really have 2 main set of abstractions. And really what NAPALM is doing is providing you a standard set of abstractions for interfacing to network devices. And the 2 categories, they have a set of get operations. So you go and get something, and it returns structured data back to you in a uniform form. So I'm going to forget the names of their get operations, but there's something pertaining to get BGP. So you can get certain aspects of get BGP, and it's going to get you back, BGP, neighbors, information pertaining to you. And it's not going to come back as just a string blob. It's going to come back as structured data that you can deal with in a programming language. So if you were dealing with NAPALM in Python, you could take operations on that. We're dealing with it in Ansible, we can do things with this information that we get back from it. Now, I think the getters are fine. They're a lot of work to implement, especially on something like Cisco iOS, which just brings back strings because someone has to write all that code that does the parsing. Now, I think more interesting, more valuable is the config management abstractions in NAPALM. So NAPALM is trying to basically implement better abstractions for config management. So it lets you do a full config replace. So I have a config on my Ansible control machine. It gets pushed up to the networking device, and in some way it becomes committed and becomes the active config, completely replacing the previous config. And associated with that, you can do a compare config before you execute this, so you know what's going to change before you do it. If you decide you don't want to do it, you can discard the config before you commit it. You can also do a rollback to a previous config. So these are very useful if we're going to do a lot of config management on networking devices. We need a way to stage the config. We need a way to commit it. We need a way to roll back. This is also very useful if we want to move towards like a CI/CD pipeline. So if we're going to start moving towards a world where we say all network changes are made from the tools, my mode of operation is I commit changes into something like Git first, go through a series of tests, eventually my change gets approved and automatically gets deployed, and it's deploying full configs. We really need abstractions like this to accomplish that.
Doesn't the default template function kind of have that already?
In the Ansible 2.1 modules?
Of the default J2 template module.
No, I don't think that's the case. Like I looked at it in Cisco iOS, and it doesn't have.
I didn't mean the iOS one. I meant just the J2 template module for, spitting out an XML interface file.
Right, but that works with Cumulus. It doesn't work with the.
Yeah, but I mean, let's say the default modules within Ansible have that functionality. It's you need a slightly different framework for when you're pushing, commands to a remote device rather than pushing a file and restart.
That's what it is.
Yeah, so you're just saying on Linux that you can accomplish these things
without any module at all, right? Like the base Ansible functionality has that already. I mean, rollback and discard and that kind of thing, no, but definitely the merge and replace, show you diffs and whatnot. Because you're kind of modifying a remote file rather than pushing a series of commands to it or an SSH connection.
I mean, it depends on what you're trying to do. So yeah, for example, so if you say like the user module in Ansible, the user module in Ansible is going to go check the remote machine, right?
I meant specifically the template module. So like if you're spitting out a DHCP config for a Linux host or whatever, just some flat file that's moving over there, it'll compare the difference.
Yeah, so the template module, it'll generate the new file.
Compare what's there.
It'll compare the two, and it'll push the new one over there.
But it'll also tell you in the output like which lines have changed.
But it's running on the thing with the template. It's building the code and then shipping it to whatever we want, and then doing the stuff there. On the Cisco device, you're not pushing that code there. You're running it from the laptop.
Yeah, so.
Sorry, I might have derailed.
No, it's all good. I mean, the template module wouldn't roll it back for you.
No.
I mean, you'd have to tell it to deploy the other config. It's not going to give you the diff just normally. I don't know if in VBV, in verbose mode, I don't think you see the diff.
Actually, if you could do, I think it's -f diff, it'll actually show you the config differences when it runs the playbook.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, it's, in that regard, it's much easier for Ansible, right? Because they're just using a Unix-like diff on the file.
Exactly, yeah.
Transfer the file over there.
Yeah, what is this?
It's Mike.
Oh, okay. It's kind of
Next
cool.
time, yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Did you have other question on that?
Whenever,
it's just
whenever somebody has a question, just get this to Mike.
Okay, where are we at here? All right, so
we were recording the event, so that's why we can already hear each other, but there's people online, and
it's all good. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Did that make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, aspects of these things are likely in, the Ansible modules concerning Linux operations, but in fairness, it is a lot easier to implement a lot of these things in that context too. And what we're trying to do in the networking world is move towards that we have a lot of those abstractions one way or another, in the way you guys are doing it, where you're making the platform a lot more like Linux, or somehow building these things on top of other platforms.
I was also kind of thinking in your CI/CD kind of pipeline. In your CI/CD kind of pipeline example, your commit and rollback functionality, you'd basically get in the Git portion of it natively as well. Like you can merge a branch, revert that change, see who made the change, that kind of thing as well. Yeah. You just need a mechanism of doing the diff change in the reverse order, I guess.
mean, that's great as long as your network is reachable.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the rub, right?
Yeah.
You know, you also need to think through this, like, okay, how do I handle the case when the network's not reachable, or at least how do I engineer it in such a way that I'm comfortable enough pushing these changes?
Is that the same for this kind of module though as well? Like you'd still have to SSH back in and apply the reverse of the diff or something, right?
You know, I don't think there's any, and this is, I would say, something that maybe need to be added to NAPALM, but it would be nice to have a confirm mechanism as well. Now, some of these would be platform limited, and what I mean by a confirm mechanism is some things like Juno OS, you can say, commit this change for a certain amount of time, and if I don't commit it again, it auto rolls back. So if my network is no longer operational, where I can't commit it a second time in 10 minutes, then it rolls back to the previous state. So in your processes, you have to engineer and think about, you know, how do I handle big problems? And you also have to think about your testing. How do I try to make sure that big problems don't happen, right? Because obviously with network automation, we could make bigger issues than we probably could in other situations. You know, in other situations, when you're entering that command into the router and you hit enter and you bang a few times and you no longer have your terminal, you have a pretty quick feedback loop that stuff has went bad. You might not have as quick a feedback loop when you're pushing out a set of changes to 50 devices or 100 devices, you know, where it went wrong.
Hey, so in that regard, does any of this tooling work with a serial console?
You know, I've done testing with PySerial. So I've definitely done testing with that. It probably would not work as is with Serial Console. I have in the back of my head that I would like to add PySerial support to NetMiko. Basically, right now NetMiko is inherently SSH based, but I should be able to abstract the connection mechanism from the methods that do things like enable and going into config mode, and make one of those connection methods be a serial channel. And similarly, unfortunately, there's still a lot of people that they use Telnet. And I mean, it's a sad state of affairs when you build an SSH screen scraping library and people are saying, come on, give me Telnet, right? You know, it's a really bad state of affairs. But I mean, if I abstracted those, then that transport becomes pretty easy. And I could have SSH, Telnet, and you know, a serial channel. And then if I did that, then some of these are built on top of NetMiko. And then you should be able to potentially use those things on top of that. So the answer is no, but there might be possible ways to get that.
I'm looking for Juniper. Yeah, it's a Shim Exploit. I'm working for Juniper. We do have implemented netconf over console for like the basic operation. So you don't want to do many things, but you can reboot the device, load the basic configurations, bring it to a state where you have basically an IP address, and you can use SSH. But it's actually part of the Ansible modules already.
So I had a couple questions. So one person online is asking about the benefits of using NAPALM over Ansible. If you only have Cisco iOS NOx, and I'm going to assume he means you can use NAPALM straight as Python, or you could use NAPALM in conjunction with Ansible. So I'm going to assume he's meaning what are the trade-offs of using sort of straight Python for automation versus using Ansible and Ansible modules. You know, one thing is, if you're doing straight Python, it's going to presuppose you know enough about programming in order to accomplish this. If you're going to use modules, you still need to use programming, but I'd say it's a lighter weight programming. I fundamentally view Ansible still as a programming language. I mean, it has abstractions, it has conditionals, it has for loops, it has complex data structures, but it's probably a lighter weight programming, and you could leverage the work people have done with modules more. Now, I think on the flip side, there are things that are harder in Ansible. So if you are a programmer, you know, you might want to just stay in Python and do it in there. Like I think in Ansible, it can be hard to do this interaction of I'm getting operational data, like output of show commands, and I'm making decisions based upon those to take certain actions. Putting a lot of logic, trying to make complex data structures in Ansible, to me, is much harder than doing it straight in Python. So there are trade-offs depending on your skill set between the two. Okay. All right, let me show you an example of loading a full config. All right, so I have this NAPALM config. So here's the playbook for accomplish that. I'm going to run this on this Pinet router 1. I'm going to run the NAPALM install config module, username, password, host name. This OS is just saying that's a Cisco iOS device. That was in the Ansible host file, so in the Ansible inventory. This is the config file it's going to push. Right now, I'm not going to commit the changes. So it's going to SCP a file up to the box. It's going to sit on the flash file system of the box. And I'm going to get a diff back, and it's going to tell me what's different between the file that I transferred up there versus what is currently in the running config. Excuse me. And when this is done, I should have a updated diff file, which I think it's probably got a difference in the logging. I think the logging buffer is different between the two configs. And I think there was another question a minute ago that was asking about, I had in there just a references to the provider in Ansible 2.1. Somebody was asking about this credentials. All that is Ansible 2.1 has a way of, as opposed to having to specify the host, the username, the password separately as 3 separate variables and having to do that every time for each task, you can basically stuff that into a dictionary and just provide that dictionary. So that's all I did there. Now, if this worked correctly, you'll see that 184.105, that's the machine we were running against. And there's the one change that it would need to make. So if I commit that change, it would go ahead and push out that config. Up on the flash, there is this full config. I could do these operations like discard. Once I committed it, there would actually be a rollback file. I could then push that rollback and it would go back to the previous state. You know, I was testing this earlier, I think yesterday, with Arista, which is using eAPI. Arista has, at least in a certain version of Arista, has a commit feature. So it's using that Arista commit feature. It's basically, you know, pushes up the changes that way. Juniper is using a netconf mechanism to do its commit operations. So I tested it with all 3 of those platforms. It was all working good to execute those changes. Yeah.
So I may have missed this during the talk, but what is the benefit of using NAPALM over the included iOS config module?
So I like the set of abstractions in NAPALM better than the set of abstractions for config changes in Ansible 2.1.
Okay.
I like having the capability of transferring, a file or a part of a file, as opposed to having to transfer a lot of commands.
Okay.
Now, if you started to get into I'm doing like 1 or 2 commands, then I probably would just say, well, I'm just going to execute it on the config channel and maybe use ntc-ansible, which we're going to talk about in a minute, has something similar to that as well, like a line-by-line config. I'd probably say, well, I'm just going to do it that way. But if I get like a 50-line ACL or even a 10-line ACL or certainly a larger section of config, then I would rather have this kind of abstractions where I can push the config up. I can do a diff to make sure there's nothing else changing that I don't expect. It'll make an automatic sort of checkpoint that I could roll back to if I needed to. So I like having those set of abstractions better than doing the config changes the Ansible 2.1 way. Yes.
Can you pass the mic?
So I'm just going to play the. Well, that's a pretty big mic. All right. So I'm just going to play the devil's advocate here. The example you showed, IP permit something, 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 it's just a cut and paste from the iOS CLI.
Mm-hmm.
What's the benefit of using this? I'm trying to figure it out. I mean, where's the benefit beyond?
Well,
I mean, what would have happened if I just cut and pasted those iOS command lines and replaced some of the things with a variable? That would have done a similar job.
well, so at a high level, yeah, you could cut and paste. That would work fine. Now, let's say you need to change your enable secret on 250 devices. I don't really want to do that.
So
I've done that before. I don't want to do it again.
okay, so no, actually that's not the point I was trying to make.
Okay.
I understand the benefit of actually having a variable in the iOS, and you can actually do it very easily with a template. So, and that's the point I'm trying to make. What is the benefit of just having a simple template with some of the fields replaced by a variable, and the variable comes from the environment somewhere, some code or something else?
But how do you get it? How do you get it to the box?
So you are not actually getting it to the box. You are running the CLI commands over SSH there. In the Cisco example that you gave.
Yeah, but it's on a Linux box. This
Yeah.
is.
What you are doing just playing out CLI commands for the Cisco box. I understand for the Arista box and for the Juniper box,
But I'm playing out the iOS commands from. So this machine here is an AWS Linux machine. So this machine here.
Yeah, that's my laptop. Let's say that's my laptop.
Okay.
So yeah, that's why I said I was just going to play the devil's advocate.
No, but I'm not understanding your point. So this is an AWS Linux machine running somewhere in the cloud of Amazon. It has the config on it. It's pushing the config to a Cisco router that's in a different data center.
Sure, I can do that from my laptop too. I can have the same code running on my laptop.
How?
And
what are you using to push the config?
You're just playing out the CLI commands, right? There are CLI command modules that actually.
No, I'm running a program.
Right.
That automatically SSHs into it, goes and does a bunch of things, pushes the config. In the case of NAPALM, does a bunch of other things to get it there.
Sure. Fine. I understand that benefit. That's one benefit. The other benefit I was trying to get to is actually a lot more. Probably would be a lot more useful. Is this? You're basically not the config example you showed is not that different from the iOS config. So I was basically trying to get to the point is that is it the best that can be done, or that can be a better abstraction model?
Well, you have to deal with what we have. iOS has its config file its way, right? It's a text-based hierarchical config. So with iOS, when you push changes, Cisco tried to do 1PK as an API. 1PK was awful. I would rather do SSH screen scraping. They end-of-lifed it really rapidly because they recognized it was awful. So you sort of have to deal with what you have. Now, something like Junos, which is XML under the hood, yeah, I could make an XML file.
Yeah, I mean,
the XML.
yeah, that there I can see the difference. I mean, it's much more amenable to programming than the iOS CLI.
There's different points here.
I'm not trying to defend Cisco iOS by any means.
I mean, I think there is still value, even for legacy devices that don't have some structured data, or the structure is not as robust, as other things like XML or JSON. But there still is value in having an automation system where you can remotely deploy those changes and automate things that you previously had to do by hand.
I mean, you still have to write that config, right? So things like that. I mean, I mean, you are not exactly.
But I mean,
you still have to do some work. So.
Yeah. I mean, go write it in XML and you'll be wishing for writing it in CLI.
Yeah, it's not the Amazon dash button. So.
I'm gonna grab the box for it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way around. You're still going to have to come up with the config, regardless of. I mean, if it was XML, if it was JSON, if it was open config Yang models, you still have to write and say what it is.
But those are much more amenable to programming. That's the point I was trying to make.
Definitely. Yeah, it'd be great. But, sort of back to one of my original points is networking equipment is out in the field a long time. 6500s are going to be out there a long time.
They only have 7 years official life.
Even longer. I mean, people run them 5-10 years after end of life easy.
This company is going to support them in 7 years.
It'd be great if all we had was very good APIs using structured data. It'd be great if there was a uniform data model that all the devices understood. There's some movements towards these kind of things, but the state is what it is at this point, right?
I think the benefit is not as apparent here because it's a very rudimentary example, where maybe even NAPALM does that. But for example, we use NCS from TLF, which is not owned by Cisco, where.
So we use TLF that's now owned by Cisco. Where you can actually define your configuration in a platform-independent structure.
In Yang, right?
And effectively, yeah. But you basically can either define it in the Cisco way or Juniper way, and it will actually translate it on the back end based on the platform you're connecting to. So in essence, probably NAPALM can do that as well. You can basically say, what if I need to configure 20 neighbors on this router, 20 BGP neighbors? You can feed it a list of neighbors, right, and maybe a list of authentication strings, and it will build the configuration, even for Cisco iOS.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to basically do the line by line by line by line anymore.
Well, you have to do the definition of the config in Yang.
Right. No, but what I said is like to answer your question, that that would be the benefit of that, where you feed it just the changes, and it will build all the structured commands out of this.
Yeah, no, it would be great, if we had widely adopted open config and you could just say, here's my BGP definition, and it has these characteristics. And then either on box or via some translation layer that was software, it would know if it's Juniper, go and do this. If it's, this is implemented in this state, and make sure it's that way. If it's iOS XR, go and do this. If it's a legacy device, Cisco iOS, go and do this, etc. And there's definitely movements in that direction. I mean, there's a lot of people working on open config. I know David Barrasso on NAPALM has been working on adding some open config support. So there's definitely movements in that direction. So that would be great. You could.
Yeah, and TLF is one of the few products that does that already. It's a commercial product.
Yeah.
But I think Ansible, if it doesn't do it already, it's aspiring to do the same thing effectively for free.
it doesn't really have that sort of open config vendor neutral data model. Ansible is providing you this way of doing config management, and somebody in an open source library or something else could bolt on the understanding of Yang to make that happen, and David's working on that in NAPALM, and I know Rob Shakir, who works with OpenConfig, did the PyYang bind work. So, I think probably the next step with OpenConfig, there's a lot of people that are working on getting it on box, but there's also going to be movement and there is movement in the open source to say, well, for things that don't support on-box OpenConfig, I can just write a translation engine that says, if it's this Yang model, this is what it spits out if it's X platform, right? And then somebody just has to write the drivers that says for any given thing you want to support. And then you could, if you had it all coded correctly, you could say, well, I don't want to run this Arista edge router anymore. I want to switch it to iOS XR, push the new config, pull the Arista one out, put the new one in, right? And that would be great if we could get there.
So have you done any kind of configuration of SDN devices?
Oh, you mentioned the nasty S word. Oh, that's verboten. We don't allow the S word anywhere. What do you mean by SDN?
Oh, I will come back to.
Well, so I'm not a believer in the general controller programming routes. I think it has.
That's essentially what you're doing. You're building the
Well, I'm using this as a config management tool. I'm pretty skeptical of having a centralized controller dynamically programming routes. I think there might be specific use cases, but I don't think it's that great or that good of an idea in general. There's a lot of problems that other people a lot smarter than me have brought up about, centralizing the control plane and kind of issues you get into. I also think in the network automation space that there's a lot of very low-hanging fruit that are orders of magnitude easier than trying to dynamically program routes on a large scale. So for me, when I'm thinking about how can I save human work and human effort, that's not the problem I want to tackle. I think there's a lot easier returns for our money for things that are very time consuming, that are much, much easier than that problem to solve. All right, so I am running out of time. So can I have 5 more minutes? All right.
Maybe, there's Q&A. I guess if people are willing to stay after Jawhny's presentation, then we can have a general Q&A because I think we have more material.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, because I hadn't got to it yet, I wanted to bring up some of the capabilities of ntc-ansible. So this is really the only thing I wanted to cover in addition, was there are some useful things in the ntc-ansible library that gives you things pertaining to what I'll call operational actions.
Does NTC stand for anything?
It stands for Network to Code, which is the company that basically made this. So install OS. So if you're upgrading OS on a bunch of devices, that is a very time-consuming operation, and network engineers aren't always very good about doing this because it is so time-consuming. So you frequently let a lot of devices get fairly old. There's interesting aspects of the way he did show command. Now, this is just executing show commands, but he bound this to something called text FSM, and he's able to take things that would just be unstructured strings and parse them using complex regular expressions and convert them into structured data. So he has a whole set of templates which convert show commands into structured data. So I run show IPint brief on a Cisco device, which just gives me a string blob back. I get structured data back instead. So this is a pretty cool thing that he's done. And you could use these in other contexts outside of Ansible as well. So as opposed to having to do all this string processing, which is very time consuming, you can just get dictionaries and lists and other data structures back that are much easier to work with. He has a get fax, which ties into Ansible fax directly. So you can get things like the model number. You can run this get fax, get the model number, then you can start taking Ansible actions based on the model of the device. Do a SCP copy of files up to the file system. The config command is pretty similar to what we saw already with Ansible 2.1. Use an SSH channel to go and execute configs. He makes a rollback checkpoint, so sort of like we had in NAPALM. So you could basically make a checkpoint that you could potentially roll back to, reboot a device. I think that one, at least for iOS, has a way you could tell it to reboot in some delayed timer. So there are useful things in ntc-ansible, particularly this show command with binding to the templates, and also this OS upgrade. And I think there's more work that network engineers, programmers need to do to make this automation of OS upgrades to make that be a lot less time consuming. So he's done some amount of work, but I think there's probably more work that we need to do there as well. Okay, so I think that's the main things I wanted to talk about. Is there other questions that people wanted to bring up?
Pass the mic, and we only really have 5 minutes left.
We're going to see a demo of any of these commands.
I can show you a demo afterwards. I have the stuff running.
Okay.
So why don't I just show it to you afterwards? It's probably the easiest way
to
do it.
Yeah, if people are, after the presentation from one-on-one, welcome to have more conversation. But some of us, are on the schedule, 9:30.
Yeah, definitely. And I have, I work through examples pretty much of each of these 3 libraries and so forth. So I have them there on that machine, and they're all ready to go. So if you want to see them, just come up to me after his talk.
Okay.
Did you cover the questions from the channel?
Let's see.
Runtime.
Let's see if I've missed other questions. We all good there? Okay, cool. Thank you.
Oh, it's in the meeting.
Yeah. All right, so I'm just going to introduce myself verbally. I'm more of a Donald Trump kind of speaker. I don't have a script. I just kind of go from the hip. Hopefully I won't say anything too preposterous, and we'll kind of go from there. A little bit about myself. I'm an old crusty guy who spent a long time working under a bridge at a company called Cisco. I worked there for about 15 years before coming here, which for me should tell you, or at least going back to we're hiring, should tell you that this company was compelling enough for me to leave a company that I had been at for 15 years to come here to a fairly young startup, and enjoy the whole ride. In fact, it's been quite an interesting ride for that matter. What am I going to show you? So as part of us learning to, I would say, pivoting to using Ansible to do our network configuration, we ran into lots of different things, trials and tribulations, configuration problems, hand, finger, typos, all those types of things. And we had to do our best to get rid of those problems and be really efficient about the way that we get things done. I started off learning about Ansible actually very recently. I knew a little bit about Python, I knew a little bit about Ansible, and then really kind of took off once we started using Cumulus as our primary network vendor. We did have, and we still do have, a little bit of Juniper here and there on our network, but we're slowly moving towards a homogeneous environment of Cumulus for our networking, with the exception of our edge routers. With that said, I had to learn it the hard way, which was trial and error, and I made a lot of mistakes. And believe it or not, one of the mistakes that I made was trying to emulate an entire network in Vagrant on my laptop. It didn't work too well. Once you get past about 8 boxes, things fall over. And so very recently, I learned of another product called Ravello. I don't know if you ever heard of it. That's what I pivoted to in order to be able to scale the testing that we're doing and so on. So what I'm going to show you is a little bit of Ravello and how I got it up and running. And then I'll show you some of the best practices, or at least the practices that we're using to use Ansible to configure our network. And we'll kind of go from there. I'll totally free-flowing kind of guy. If you want to interrupt, just throw your hand up or whatever.
Yeah, just use that big square.
Yeah, the big thingamabobber, the catch box, and we'll kind of go from there. Give me a second to get set up, and we'll go from there. Are there things that folks want to make sure that I cover? I'll do the best I can, but there are things that you want to like, hey. No? All right. Figures. That's very weird because I already have BlueJeans installed. I was forcing me up. Strange.
Yeah. Whatever.
Yep.
It's on your. Yeah.
All right. Let me start with Ravello, and we'll go from there. Sorry, I've got too many windows open right now. And I think I made the fatal mistake of joining as an attendee.
You can share.
I think they sent them the wrong link. Really?
Yeah.
I've never had that problem before.
Doesn't like me. Hey. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is just a basic topology in Ravello, and then I'll show you how we used BX, Cumulus's BX, to virtualize and use that to emulate our network and how we configure a couple of devices. The topology is pretty straightforward. We have a spine leaf configuration. We have 2 spines at the top, 2 sets of leaves, 2 pairs of leaves at the bottom, and the leaves are connected to both spines. We have basically 4 connections coming off of the spine to this side and 4 going that way, 8 total on each spine. And that's the topology. Very, very straightforward, very simple topology. And what you see here on the left is the actual image, it's the BX image. So if you go to cumulusnetworks.com and become a member there, there's a place where you can download this VX network. And then in Ravello, you upload this image, the OVA, at which point you can start building and designing the network and go from there. One of the things that I also learned by using just pure Vagrant is the configuration file that's used to manage the topology can get really unruly in terms of what's connected to what. It's a flat text file. It gets really hard to manage. And then you've got to use another tool to generate. So while I love Vagrant, and I really do, if I'm doing something more than a few boxes, 2 or 3 boxes, it's not the best thing on your computer because you probably have a lot of things going. So my recommendation, if you have the ability, is to use this product. I have no association with them at all. It just happens to work really well. And we'll go from there.
Can you get the mic at somebody? Oh.
Yes. So what happens is, let me.
That's fine.
So one of the things that we always do. Yeah. So he's asking like, why am I doing that? Is that for resources purposes? And the answer is yes. So one of the challenges that you have, of course, with anyone in IT is you have 1,001 applications running in the background. You're trying to multitask. And as you start to spin up a test environment, it starts to drag down your resources and it gets really, really hard to get things done. Everything slows down. So I'm basically offloading that whole idea of spinning up your lab environment, or in this case, a mimic of your production environment into Revela. So before I go to the demo, let me take a step back and tell you about our workflow, because I guess that's really the most important piece of this all. I'm an old school network guy, and I come from a world where I just go onto the keyboard, or I cut and paste the config, like, hey, I've got the template, looks right, boom, cut and paste, and I'm good, right? That's where I come from. And so now I'm here in a DevOps team, and when you say, hey, I'm just going to cut and paste my config onto some device, that you've got 2 heads. What are you talking about, network dude? And so the answer is to create config files, templates, your actual entire Ansible playbook for your entire infrastructure, load it into Git or repository, make your changes there, pull those changes down into Ansible, those templates into Ansible, and push those out. So it has a normal software release type of workflow. That's how you get things done here when it comes to the network.
One of those guys that would look at him sideways if
Yes,
we would say he was
yes.
going to copy and paste. There is a reason why we want everything in version control. It's because it's version controlled, right? If you're interacting, there's a team of 20 people and everybody starts doing stuff on their, box by themselves. How are you going to scale that, right? And that's just not the way you can go to the next level. So with having your code, your configuration actually executable in your version control system, you know what your state is at any point in time, because what's in your version control is what is running, right? So that's the concept behind it. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's kind of built into the repository aspect of it. You can see who's done changes and come back. Shaq, you were going to fire?
I was just going to say the other thing is if you don't keep everything in some sort of version control or a centralized repo, when something goes wrong and you've got a data center with 200 devices, 200 network devices alone, and something's wrong in the network, guess which one is going to be the one that changed? It's going to be the last one that you check. Whereas if you have everything in a central repo and you work from that central repo, and something went wrong somewhere around 2:42 p.m., you look at all of your changes that happen plus or minus 10 minutes of 2:42, and that'll tell you, okay, I've narrowed down from 200 devices, 4 devices where a change happened. So having everything flow through a central point, even if it's not for revision control, but to have a centralized view and a track of all of your changes for audit purposes I can't even stress how important that is. And it's saved us a few times from not having to go and check on the network, just being able to say, no, I can bet you $100 right now, my network config did not change. So.
And then I would say the last and probably the biggest benefit that I've realized from putting my code, if you will, into a repository is we actually use GitHub in a private repo. and we share that private repo with Cumulus, who's our vendor. And so at any point in time, if there's a question about what is your running config, you don't have to do the like, oh, let me get you a show tech, a show run, or whatever. They already have it. There's no question about what was done or who did what or who committed when. And the other thing is that if the vendor should want to make a change, they can actually go into the repo, make a branch, make the change that they want to do in that branch. We can get on a call, a BlueJeans call, validate that the output of that change is what we want to be, and then merge it back in and go from there. That's a big one. That's a huge one. Is to have your vendor actually directly access your configs.
So can you just emulate the network, or do you also have the ability to emulate any traffic?
You can do both. Because it's a Linux box, there are other traffic generation tools that you can use to do that. And because you have, and you're talking about specifically for Revela,
Yeah,
you can see here, like I've got an Ubuntu image. I can just put servers down here, connect them to this network, give them an IP address, and they can pump traffic to each other. I can actually put edge devices out here as well.
Okay.
So yes is the.
Cool.
Yep.
I just want to make a comment to that. So
Sure.
I have a similar setup like this, and I actually run an OpenStack, lab, and we actually have OpenStack, running in a very, just like a bare bones kind of state, connected to the network devices. We have both Juniper and Cumulus in the environment. So having this sort of staging environment has saved me a lot of problems, because basically I run into all my mistakes in this environment and
That's
not
right.
in the production environment. So my customers are really happy that I'm making all my mistakes somewhere else, and when it's time to make a change, I'm fairly confident that whatever I'm doing, I have experience because I've been trying it out for 2 weeks.
Right.
Testing this, testing that, testing to see how it interacts with the OpenStack environment. And then at that point, when you go ahead and make the change, I have 2 weeks under my belt of, hey, I've done this many times. So the actual doing it in production should be pretty quick. And in most cases, a maintenance window, even though we give an hour, typically lasts only 10 minutes.
5-10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. I have the same experience, exact same experience in terms of the maintenance window being very short. Other general questions before I? No rush at all. All right. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the basic topology. First, I want to show you the layout of our folders and how we do things. There's a couple things that, as you start to get into things, it becomes the best practice. Let me share that too. Things that I've discovered have really saved my bacon. There we go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of the folders that you might have, or the structures of your layout within Ansible. So you have your playbooks. So you have, in this case, I'll use the main one. Oh, okay, that's right. That's right. Should have known. Good. Roles are your friend. Still too small? My turn to look at you kind of strange. All right, make it even bigger. So there's some understanding of Ansible, I imagine, in the room, but one of the things that I've discovered is that roles are your friend. My first foray into this, I was really lazy and just made one big folder called Common, and it had everything in it. It was the kitchen sink. And then what happened is it broke. And then I had to pile through, like, what the heck happened inside this configuration, inside this playbook, to know what's what. So one of the things that I've learned is to have roles that make sense to what the actual task that's being executed is. So in this case, very clear. You can, without even actually looking at the roles, someone else can come behind me and go, okay, to set up this server, I'm going to configure the NTP, I'm going to configure the Quagga default, then I'm going to run spine, which is the role of the actual device itself, and then I'm going to restart networking, and Bob's your uncle. Some of these can get really long and lengthy, like, let's see. This one gets a little bit longer, but you can kind of go through this and look at that and go, okay, here's what I'm going to do my networking, here's what I'm going to do the NTP, and so on. So I highly recommend getting used to roles. Don't make the mistake of having one big folder that you're going to call common because it's common that they all would have DNS. Don't do it. Don't do it. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, it was a little bit of a question, kind of we went back and forth about VARs and what's going on with the VAR variables and what's the general benefit. So my experience has been that where you can, if you can standardize the way that your network is laid out, then you actually don't need to have several templates. You really only need one or two templates that are managed through VARs. So that's sort of one of the things that we're working through as you get older. Well, as you start one an implementation of a network and you're not using this type of methodology, things start to move organically. Like, oh, somebody went in the closet, they moved something around, and it becomes a problem where now you can standardize on a couple of templates and enforce those templates through this method. I was going to kind of touch on a little bit when you were talking about, like, what's the value of that I can kind of cut and paste and so on. Does that help, or any other thoughts around it? Sure. Not going to beat you. Not going to beat you out. It's fine. So at any rate, we manipulate the templates through variables. And so at the end of the day, because we have only two types of devices, spines and leaves, we really only have two templates, a spine and a leaf. Everything else really is common, but like I said earlier, putting things in common turns into a train wreck. All right. Let's go back here. Big enough? Need it bigger?
You guys can read that in the back?
No.
Okay.
Do we need to?
Well, if you're here, you might as well.
All right. So what I'm going to do is a couple of other things that I'll recommend. I have a playbook called main. You kind of looked at it earlier. It configures, in that case, leaves and spines. It's one big playbook. It does both. I highly recommend also using the limit tag flag there, option -L. And in this case, I'm going to push a configuration into Ravella onto a VX image that emulates Cumulus network. So
your host file is pointed at Ravella.
yes. Maybe I should step back and actually talk a little bit more about what's going on that side before I get way down the rat hole. I'm sorry for not spending more time on the setup of what's going on with Ravella. Where is the app? There we go. Okay, so all of the hosts are connected to a workbench system, which is this guy right there. And this is just an Ubuntu server. In real implementation on our network, the workbench device is actually another Cumulus switch called an RMP. And since it's all running Linux, we basically take the same packages, which is Ansible, and configure it to run on in production on a switch. In this example, it's running on an Ubuntu server, but we actually do run that, and that's our out-of-band management system. So if we wanted to configure a device out of band, we actually go to a switch in that data center, which is connected to the Ethernet 0 interfaces on the leaves or spines, and then from there, push out our Ansible config, pull in the repo, and push out the configs that way. So every one of those devices has an Ethernet 0 interface. I'll show it to you. It's right here. And that Ethernet 0 interface is on this 10.0.254.x network, which is connected to the workbench, which is 10.0.254.254. So that's my out-of-band management connection to everything. So Ansible is connecting directly to the Ethernet 0 interfaces on all these Cumulus VX devices. Other questions about the general setup? I know you're like, dude, enough of the suspense, right? Okay. So I'm going to run the Ansible playbook, the main playbook we talked about earlier, and I'm going to limit it to leafs. Limit is your friend. I've even gone so far as to limit it to the individual devices, especially if I'm going to do something in a crisis. Part of that is because after you do a run, for the most part, you have to reset or reload interfaces on a Cumulus device, and that's going to cause some sort of an impact depending on how your network is set up. So at any rate, I'll run the playbook, and you'll start to see where the breaking out the roles starts to make a little bit more sense. And this is going to run against all leaves. And of course, there's the suspense of will it run by the demo gods.
How hard was the Ravello setup, just getting everything sort of set up in that environment?
I learned Ravello in about 3 hours, tops.
Is it a commercial product?
It is, ravellosystems.com.
So you used...
In this case, it's just the network setup, but you can include a server setup. There technically is a server. The server that's actually running Ansible and configuring all these devices is part of this Ravello setup. Yeah, in a real, like if you're really going to...
Oh, okay.
Sure. If you're going to set it up and you're going to include generating traffic, you can include Ubuntu images, whatever other devices to generate traffic in that set of images down at the bottom.
Or just for your current practice, when you do those network simulation, you only do the networking layer, or you also already include...
Yes. So yes, on both. So we do both. Sometimes I do just the network. If I'm validating like flows and whether or not things are going to fail over the proper way, then I will add hosts on the end. I'll put a host down at the bottom on a leaf, and I'll put an edge device and a host outside of my network. And then I'll just run a ping test or a traffic flow between those two devices. And then I may like shut off a link, see if it fails over, and so on. All those features work, and they work just as they would in production.
Okay.
Sorry, say again?
Can we use the mic?
I'm sorry, I didn't even hear what you said. Yeah.
So I think Cisco has a software product called VIRL or something like that actually does the same thing.
Okay, good. Yeah.
But yeah, you have to pay. It's not free.
Oh.
So,
yeah, that's
how much is
pretty inexpensive.
For how many devices? For one device.
Wait, so is it like $200 per person per seat, per arm, leg, etc.? All right, fair enough. Well, that one is free, except for Ravello, which the way that Ravello works, I'll go ahead and segue while this is doing its thing. The way that Ravello works is that you have a choice. If you already have like AWS or something like that, you can point it at your AWS implementation. If you don't have AWS and you really don't care, you just want the system to work, you just say, find the best price out there and set up this implementation on whatever works for you. In this case, this is running on Google Compute. I've never logged in. I don't even have an account for Google Compute. Never saw their implementation in my life. My only view of the universe right now is through Ravello. I have no idea how they configured it. I don't care. But it works. And so what they do is they find whichever one has the cheapest price,
and they'll give you that as the price for your business pay per use. So this setup, which has 8 devices in it, is something like 80 cents for an hour. And then you'll set it up when you start the actual system. You'll set it up and say, I only want to run this system for an hour. And at the end of the hour, it'll tear it down for you, hands free.
So what's the largest system you have simulated so far?
The largest has been, let me count here. 32 switches plus some couple spines, maybe 34, a few hosts, something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It was pretty expensive to do, but I only needed to test a couple things. So,
do you have a way to automate the creations on Revelo? Because honestly, I use that as a pain in the ass.
Yeah. So I would say the blueprints feature, where you can say like it starts with this base and works up. You could do it that way, but I don't know that they have an API. I haven't seen anything that has an API that you can say, sort of like AWS, where you kind of.
They do have an API. Everything has an API.
Okay, then it would probably be some sort of an API tickle that you could do, but I don't know of an automated way beyond doing the flat files thing, which falls back into some sort of vagrant-y, like all these things are connected in very odd ways. Kind of
what you would use most likely the dynamic inventory.
Yeah, the issue is more when you change the image, for example. You change the image of the VM.
Oh.
To rebuild everything.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of crazy.
Yeah, it is. It is, for sure.
Have you started to automate the testing much? Like, you're talking about building the systems. Have you also started to work on automation of the testing when you do that?
We're not quite there yet. Typically, the spin up that we do is targeted. Like, hey, I'm thinking of making this route change or that route change, or what would happen if, or can I even do that thing? That's the typical use case that we have. But yeah, it would be great. We actually do that for our server side, where there's a bunch of validation, and when you can bring things up in Vagrant and so on, and checks that you can do. That's absolutely on the roadmap for stuff that we want to do, rather than like, typing in and going, okay, did it work? It'd be much easier to do that.
Cool.
Things with network is that the change that you expect is going to vary from time to time. So when you try to create a test, it's like, well, today I'm testing for this, but tomorrow I'm going to test for something else. So it becomes a little more hands-on. All right, so it worked. So the playbook configured the 4 leaves, and this is why you'd want to lay things out by role, right? So I configured Zebra. Yes, I did that. I configured this, and that. It's all about commenting, and it's all about making your roles make sense, or you're going to get hosed for sure. So in this case, the role is restart networking Quagga, and the task is restarting Quagga itself. And same thing in that same playbook, I have restart networking in Quagga, and this was restarting the network piece. So definitely name every task that you do and its function. So with that, put this down. This playbook is a little bit basic, and all I really did was push out host names and a basic Quagga configuration. Nothing too over the top. The reason why I did that is because I didn't want to go through a lot of work sanitizing what we were actually using in production, but I'd rather give you a base that you can work off of yourself in Revela. So I'm going to do 2 things after this talk, most likely tomorrow, is make this repo available to you that has this set of playbooks in it, and also share. They have like a repo for Revelo. So if you sign up for an account on Revelo, you can just grab this template and go from there. I think there already is one for a little bit smaller for Cumulus as well.
So what protocols are running?
OSPF, BGP. OSPF is there. They're not doing MLAG right now. Not in this, but there are other. Is there one that you want? Is there a flavor that you're looking for?
I was just curious.
Okay.
Layer 3 ECMP, or is it still layer 2?
Layer 3 ICMP?
ECMP.
Equal multipathing layer 3, yes, but
so OSPF
layer
already
2.
does that. So OSPF in the spine, recon spine
Yes.
architecture already
Yes.
does that.
Yes.
So you don't need additionally ECMP on top.
Right. We use basic classic class.
We only want to Q&A.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. Let me open it up for the floor. Other questions, things that.
So you mentioned you work for BlueJeans.
Yes, I do.
Is my boss loud enough?
No, you actually, from where you are, I really can't hear you very well.
Okay. So so you mentioned you work for BlueJeans, and BlueJeans manages a network of their own, or?
Yes. Yes. We have a mixture of implementations. We do have some services in AWS, and we have 5 data centers around the globe.
I see. And these are, how big are the footprints? Is there?
The one in San Jose is pretty beefy. In the US is pretty beefy, but in other locations, they're colos that we've put our implementation into in smaller places like
Equinix or somebody else?
Equinix, yeah.
Okay.
Some places we own the whole cage, other places we're just a rack, in a common space.
And how do you? And how do you connect these data centers? Do you have your own lease lines, or?
Wait a minute, I think Jens Meggers is somewhere around here.
How do you connect these data centers? What kind of links do you?
We have high-speed pipes.
Sorry, I don't want this into a network thing, especially now about BlueJeans network. I mean, I'm going to stay on.
Sure, fair enough. I'll ask him later. That's fine.
Sorry.
And automation, please.
That's fine.
And for the record, Jens Meggers, for those who don't know, is the senior VP of WebEx.
We can have that conversation afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to talk to you on the side if you want to talk about it. Other Ansible type questions, network automation type questions.
So how does Ansible compare with the other two, Puppet and Chef? What is the difference really?
Sure. So we use, actually it's a little bit of at the basic level, it's the language. So if you're Chef, then most likely you've got some Ruby experience.
Yeah, both Puppet and Chef are Ruby.
That's right. And if you've got Python experience, then Ansible is the next best way to go. But
So-
we've used both here, and I'm familiar enough with both.
So from your talk, I understand that the Ansible is using Git as its backend repository for cookbooks. Is that correct?
We store our cookbooks in Git. Ansible is not using it as a backend. We pull it from our repo.
I see. Okay.
Other questions?
To whom? I don't want to hit somebody on your.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, just a quick question. Like you mentioned you have 5 data centers, right? And you also have AWS. Like if you use Ansible, do you have some centralized control center? You actually have a back connection to all the data center. You can do all those things.
So yes, we have out of band. So there are really 3 connections. Like you can go in band if you're really feeling. You could do that because if you make a mistake, you shot yourself in the foot. Then you have out of band, which is what I was saying. We have an actual switch that's sitting there, and it's called an RMP switch, which is running Ansible. But the way that you get to that device is via out of band.
Okay.
Yeah. So you'll come to that one out of band, and then that is connected to the Ethernet 0, the management interfaces of each individual switch.
Okay.
Sorry, I have my.
But all your Ansible, all those script playbooks you are putting on the GitHub, actually you use outbound connection to pull into your data center.
Yes. So yes, we pull from the repo. That's actually the repo is external. Yes, the repo is external to the data center because if we have a network outage scenario, you can't get to something internally. So our configs are hosted externally so that we can pull it down from anywhere and not have a network incident prevent us from getting the repo. Hold on, take a number.
Yeah. So I was asking earlier, but can you walk through the workflow? Let's say I'm a network engineer and I want to make a change.
Yep.
I take let's say some branch with Ansible playbook, make the change. But after that, when I push the config, what happened next? Do you have like a review process, or how you do the check of that? Actually,
oh yeah, you skipped a lot of stuff in between. So okay, let me get you to the beginning. So you decide you want to change an IP address.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to go in and you're going to spin up your platform. Excuse me. Either there in Vagrant, whatever makes sense to you.
Mm-hmm.
You'll spin up your platform. You'll make your change in the platform. See if the outcome, whether you do show IP route or show whatever the routes may be, are correct. We typically will cut and paste the output that is correct, the actual expected results, like these are the config changes and these are the results, into the ticket, the actual change ticket that we have. And so that not only did you, like, it's not just you by yourself, like, yeah, it really worked just for me. You're actually showing your work in the ticket so that if you do the change and go on PTO and somebody else has to pick it up from there, they can associate the change ticket with what changes you made. Okay. So from there, you'll do your commit into the repo, right? And then you'll pull the commits down to whatever you're going to be using to push the Ansible configuration, and then you push it out there in the change window.
Okay.
Git is version controlled in and of itself.
Look at using the pull request from Git to do your validation and like pushing directly like automatic. Everything in master branch goes into productions. Have you thought about
Everything
that?
in master is something that's going to go into production.
No, but like
back to your
not
question, yeah.
through a manual intervention of a user. I'm talking about automatic.
Oh no, we don't
like
do that.
Jenkins that push directly.
No, you have to consciously, even though you validated and all that good stuff, you have to consciously go. You're like, yes. You're still gonna have to type Ansible playbook blah.
So why not? Why not having like a pull request and you open your pull request before your change, and last time you merge in and you deploy automatically.
It's a function of maturity and where we are on our path to there. If I had to be super short about it, we're just not there yet.
Actually, to like one step beyond to the other speaker's point, like why not write a test, right? That you would run privately or would run before, and then automatically it would push the mainline.
Totally, I'm not against it at all.
Yeah,
not against it at all.
And a couple of questions. So you automate a data center. How about edge? What kind of difficulties do you see? What problems?
We haven't used automation on the edge.
Okay.
For me, because there's so few edge devices and they have massive impact. Yes, they're redundant, but I don't know. That's a tightrope that they have to walk.
It's not about Ansible, but any plans of using like a software-defined WAN, like what Spotify is doing?
No, not really. I mean, at the end of the day, it really comes down to what type of provider you are. This is more personal religion at this point when it comes to this, but ISPs are QoS via big pipes, right? There's no need to do funky QoS types of things. There's no need to do more technology than you really have to get the job done, or you introduce complexity that eventually will shoot you in the foot from a troubleshooting and operational perspective. That's generally how I view things. I try to keep it as simple as possible. Now, the other side of this is that, like, in automating, you introduce complexity, so you have to weigh the benefits of that you get from the automation through productivity and so on. But like, there's complexity just getting to the fact that it's automated, right?
All right, we're gonna have to.
He's giving me the hook. Oh man.
We're already like 20 minutes past. And,
oh. Sorry, folks out there.
Just wanna, another round of questions. Thanks a lot again to Kirk and great presentation, and thanks a lot to our IT guys that stayed late, to help out with all the setup. So,
thank you.
Thanks to you guys for coming up and showing. We'll post the recording. Again, the presenters are here. I don't know how long they're going to stay here. I think Kirk has to go back to San Francisco.
Right.
So,
okay.
If you have questions.
All right, I'm still here and I have the mic. So if you have me a question, I'm still going to say it out loud. So,
yeah.
Other questions?
Have questions for me? I'm here too.
Anyone?
So what are we doing, Jenkins?
Yeah.
Sure.
Are you the organizer for this
Yeah.
Ansible group? I don't actually live here, but I work here a lot. I'm here once a month. And I do a lot of support. And I recently had to
No, Ravello. So I'm not steering you away from. Don't get me wrong. I think if you're starting there, that's great. Just be aware of how many apps that you have running. There's a couple of really awesome tools that Cumulus makes available that helps with file generation.
You're in the group? Sorry? You're in the meetup group?
Yes, I just.
So what I do is for the next event, typically what I do is I pick a topic.
It's a bear.
So this one was for network automation. And then I throw out there like, hey, does anybody looking for presenter on this topic? So I don't know what's going to be the next one, but now that you're telling me that
it got really unruly. I'll so, that. But then again, you're starting small and you can iterate on top of it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no,
I went through that same pain, right? So at the end of the day, like in terms of ease of learning, they're both about the same. In terms of maintenance and changing and things, then this guy wins hands down. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, so cool now. I don't have to write wiki pages on how to deploy Windows anymore.
Yeah, they definitely have provided a ton of tools to make that easier, but at the end of the day, you're dealing with a flat file that grows by the number of interfaces. You probably have a lot of interfaces, right? So, yeah. It is, the networking piece is a little tricky. So with Ravella, you have to configure connecting these things together as if they were going to be in a network. And then when you actually implement it, you'll find that when you boot up the devices, they don't come up with any IP addresses. You're just using that networking piece to give you a construct in your head, like this is going to be on the same subnet, right? But you just want their backend system to configure so these two devices can talk to each other. But when you actually spin up the VX and implementation, there are actually no IP addresses on it at all. That's correct. You can change them to be entirely different now. Yep. That's right. Yes, and it's hard to manage in Vagrant. So I completely agree. Yes, yes.
Okay. So you mentioned your data center
we have pipes between every data center. We're not crazy enough to do full mesh, but every site has a redundant connection to some other data center for sure.
And you mentioned the edge devices. What are these edge devices?
An edge device is something that's the WAN edge. So anything other than that WAN edge, which for us is Juniper.
So it's a networking device, or
it's the big router.
Oh, I see.
It's the BFR, or whatever you want to call it, that sits at the very edge of the network that connects to your provider. The WAN, that's right. Yeah. But everything south of that is pretty much managed this way.
So where do you have your BlueJeans video servers running?
Everywhere.
In your data centers or both?
D, all the above.
I mean, that's what pretty much it is.
Yeah, depends on what it is, but everywhere.
And you decided to use Ansible because?
Because I already knew Python. The learning curve for Python.
You knew a little bit of Python.
I knew enough Python to be dangerous with Ansible. I knew very little, if no Ruby. And Chef is a little more difficult to me. Chef is not as intuitive as Ansible is. Ansible is really just running. It's just another. Oh yeah, we still, don't get me wrong, I still use Chef as part of our infrastructure. Like, I'm in DevOps, I still have servers that, though I'm a networking guy, I still have servers that I have to, as part of the team, maintain as well. And so those are managed by Chef. So I do have Chef recipes and so on and so on. The great part about moving here is I shifted my focus from just a pure network kind of view of the world.
Well, of course, configuration is complex. How do you connect all the different pieces? There's a lot of moving parts. We try to reduce complexity as much as we can, so we don't have any other option. I know Shaq
very easy. No, it's the one that. I think if we get a company, get some dollars to a company to do the OpenStack management. In terms of resources, we don't have, like a team of 2 or 3 guys. At least one dedicated. Yeah, no, we just need the commitment from. We need a reason behind it. Like right now, the information we have with our config management and our package management is doing okay. So we're using the resources as we need them. No real dead hardware. Yeah, I mean, on the new instance, but we use AWS when we need to go into that kind of. We built a metric system, right? To grab data from everywhere. That's going against a broken system, where like on top of dealing with your metric system, you have to deal with the broken infrastructure as well, not repair whatever is not working. We don't have a team dedicated to that, so we are doing everything. Versus going in AWS, for instance, from that, hardware cost provision. But yeah, I mean, if we had, a company that would come and do our OpenStack install, I'll be doing it myself on top of everything else I'm already doing. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting and, cool, but you have to pick, you can't.
Well, what are you guys doing outside of Ansible for automation?
We Chef, copy management.
Do you do anything for Jenkins?
Right, so we do our builds, like our continuous integration with Jenkins, because that's what's there. Then we have all the tools for orchestration. We do use Ansible and Network Automation.
So you just do your build and then you don't trigger your deployments?
We are not a continuous deployment.
We unfortunately backed out our OpenStack stuff. We did, so when we brought up our Aspen site, it was we were trying it out there. And,
yeah, we do that with our Linux server. So we're already so in Jenkins, that's what we use. We have in all our
gone from start to finish. So we know how to do it. So we pulled it all out.
So it's all pro based 15 years ago. So it's also
right, so we see ourselves, but right, so in Jenkins, anytime we come into one of our,
I think the part of where we get off there, let's say we have not ready for this.
an IT table or the reason so we should change to master around. That's when the Jenkins event. So Jenkins will detect that change and it's going to trigger.
In fact, at the time.
So the Cooke, right? Like this is the code to configure Revenant. It could be the code to configure. So we have that config management, right? So the Revenant Cooke system. That's so let's say we want to change, like we need to add a default policy or some kind of change in the configuration, right? So we make that change in our code. It goes to master. Then it goes to Jenkins detects that change and runs so every repo has a script, a testing script. Right? That script just spawns the Docker, basically a Docker container. Does the configuration. No. That's just like build flow. Right. Or build test.
that we run this script, right? And then all the logic is in that script. That script runs Docker and runs Chef using our front credit or use it. Configure everything, tests it that exits fine, and then says, okay, that exit is fine, and it will and then once we have that sanity passed, we have another process where we say, okay, this is validated. Now I push this button and it makes it like this application.
Sorry to ask so many networking questions. That's what all these people are.
Yeah, I just wanted to be on